homeschoolers, it's Amber Marie from Forging Foundations. Today I'm going to be sharing with you all about the math curriculum that I use with my son during our homeschool day. I've chosen to use the Abeka Number Skills K5 workbook along with mini lessons that I've developed and manipulatives I've collected over the years. So let's go ahead and take a look at a lesson. So here's everything I use to teach my son a math lesson in a school day. As I mentioned before, we are using the Abeka Number Skills K5 workbook. There is a teacher's manual that Abeka does suggest to pair with this workbook. However, I opted to create my own lessons to go along with the pages. If we take a look in the workbook, you'll notice that the pages are very child-friendly with visuals, colors, and not too crowded on a page. The concepts that they start with are very basic kindergarten concepts such as patterns, same and different, counting, number formation, and much more. As you get further along in the curriculum, you work towards harder concepts like addition, counting money and using it to buy different objects, and measurement along with subtraction towards the end. So you can see that it's a full year's curriculum for a kindergarten level child. Another thing I like about the lessons in here are the different ways that they introduce concepts that a child needs to learn. So for example, counting. They have different methods of introducing counting to a child. For example, on this page, they go ahead and they give the number that they would like the child to circle for the objects. They also will go ahead and give a box with a certain amount of objects and then ask the child to circle the correct amount. And even further, they'll go into giving a whole page where there's more than one object, and they have to read the directions below or have the parent read and find the objects in the picture. So for example, with this, the toy shelf, and then they have to look at the picture below. Helicopters, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 helicopters, so they circle the correct number. And I like that Abeka gives them an example of what they're supposed to do. That way, after explaining it, if they forget, they can look back at the example. Also, Abeka has a lot of handwriting practice in the workbook, which is something that I am very happy about because my son could use handwriting practice with his letters, but he also needs handwriting practice with his numbers, and the numbers are a little more difficult for him to form, as I've noticed in the beginning of this book and looking at his handwriting work. So this is almost a quarter of the way through the book, and you can see that it's still practicing simple number formation, and as they get further along in the curriculum, they're going to get to a point where they're working on writing larger numbers. Like 50 to 79 and higher than that too. As I mentioned before, I do not have the teacher's manual that goes with the Abeka workbook. However, I do create my own mini lessons using the manipulatives that I have available. So just to show you a few of the manipulatives, I have the Judy clocks, which is great for practicing time. Pretend money to help with identifying the different types of coins. I got these from Lakeshore Learning. However, you can get them online as well. I also have number tiles from 1 to 100, and I have them separated into little baggies of 10s. So for each 10 family. I have colored tiles, 2 different types. I have solid colors and then transparent, which I'll talk about how I use these later. I have a bunch of buttons I got from Michael's that allow for patterns, different sizes, talking about same and different, a lot of things you can use buttons for with math. Counting bears. I've got ordinal numbers cards here. I just used index cards, cut them up, and made ordinal number cards for my son so that as we're learning about first, second, and third, we're able to do more hands-on activities with counting bears or different toys, and just having him label them with the ordinal number and seeing what it looks like really helps him learn those. And then I have a die here. I'd like to get some more dice. There's dice out there that are 6-sided with numbers, as well as 8-sided and 10-sided, so I'd really like to collect some more of those. So I'll find those on Amazon, I'm sure. Another thing I have is the number line I created. And I just used a piece of cardstock for this, and I wanted to use a number line because a number line is very important when it comes to teaching the concept of, as numbers get further or higher on a number line, that the amount of objects or the size of that number gets larger. So I've used this with the colored blocks or the colored tiles and counting bears before, where I'd have my son just put 1, 2, 3, and he can almost see like a staircase going up, and it really helps with that basic number sense that children need to understand, that as numbers get larger, so does the amount of objects. I also use this every lesson that I teach. It's just a number chart from 1 to 30, very simple, and I underlined the one that we're working on up or counting up to. So every lesson we'll go ahead and start with just looking at this number chart, starting at 1 and having him practice counting up to 15. He's really good with 1 through 10, and 11 and 12. It's 13, 14, 15 that he always gets mixed up. So this is just a constant practice of repetition. I also have a laminated hundreds chart, which we can use buttons or beans or different types of manipulatives on top of this. And on the back, there is a blank side, so that as my son starts to learn to count up to 100 and write numbers up to 100, he can start practicing writing them in a blank hundreds chart. One of my favorite things I have is this hundreds board, and a lot of these manipulatives I've acquired through other homeschool moms that have older children now and didn't need these manipulatives anymore. So I will try to find these manipulatives somewhere online to share in the description box. But this is one of my favorite things. This is a hundreds chart, and it's a 3D type hundreds chart. And those number tiles I showed you earlier actually fit in the hundreds chart. So as my son's learning to count and learning to do higher counting with the tens, he can use these number tiles as a more hands-on learning approach and fill them in, and we can just continue to fill them in as we learn them. Another thing I mentioned before was the colored tiles. We actually go ahead and once we start learning more about counting by 5s or 2s or 10s, I can use these number tiles, the transparent ones, to cover a number where he'd still be able to see it. However, for example, let's say we're counting by 5s. If I continue with this pattern, my son's going to see that there's a pattern that's forming when we count by 5s, and it's great that he can see the numbers through them. We can color code them if we want to learn 2 different types of skip counting, 2s and 5s or 10s and 5s, and it's just, they're very versatile. When I go to plan my mini lessons to pair with this workbook, I look at the week that I have ahead, and I plan a week at a time. So for example, this week we started with lesson 11 and then went through until lesson 15. And what I like to do is I like to go to the lesson in the workbook, and like I mentioned, I did label each lesson in the top corner, so it just makes it easier for me to find. And I'll go ahead and I'll take a look at what the main math concept is that is being taught or reviewed. And on this lesson specifically, it was a very easy lesson to prepare for because it focused on counting objects higher than 10. So you can see here there's a practice sheet here, or practice spots here for counting objects higher than 10. Then it goes into a little tracing introduction for the number 5. When I'm doing a mini lesson, my mini lesson is more focused on the hands-on part, the counting and anything where they're going to need to manipulate. The handwriting practice I will address when we actually get to it in the workbook. So as you can see, this first lesson focuses on counting objects higher than 10. on both sides and then tracing practice. So when planning this lesson, I take a look at the manipulatives I have and I find which ones I feel will be the best to teach him with. And so I go ahead and I write down what I'm going to need. So I decided on using counting bears and the number tiles for this. We always start with reviewing numbers 1 through 10, and then we'll practice counting 11, 12, 13, and 14, which is what is focused on in this lesson. I will also be using, or I also used the 10 frame mats with this, and I didn't show those to you, but I'll show you them in a minute. And I'll go ahead and just collect all these things before the week starts and put them aside. And then in the morning of, I'll make sure I have what I need so that I'm not shuffling around trying to find the materials when the lesson starts, so that my son is able to focus. So before my son even gets into the workbook, I start with the mini lesson. And like I said before, I like to have everything prepared ahead of time so that I'm not wasting precious time with his attention span. And these are the 10 frames I was talking about earlier. And again, these are just index cards that I traced or drew 10 boxes on using a ruler. So you can make these super easy, but I do suggest having 10 frames for kindergarten because it is a very visual way of showing place value before you get into place value blocks and things like that. So what we do with the lesson is we'll start with the 10 frames. If it's a counting lesson, we'll go ahead and take the bears. Now my son has already practiced a whole 10 frame, and this was the first lesson where we actually introduced a second one. So we did a little review counting to 10, and we talked about how each time we added one of these, it was adding, just counting. He does know just by looking at the 10 frame, which is kind of an advantage of using 10 frames, is he does know that once it's half full, it's 5, and he knows that when the whole thing's full, it's 10. So he doesn't really have to think too much about counting it. He just can look at it and say how many are there. And for this lesson, when we got to 10, we talked about how we would need to use another 10 frame to start moving on up the numbers. And I will normally have this nearby so that he can look at it, so that he doesn't forget what comes next, as he is still learning how to count objects up to 20. And so we'll go ahead and we'll talk about, well, we have filled this 10 frame already and we can't fill any more bears on this 10 frame. So what do we need to do? We need to get another 10 frame. And I'll go ahead and put one on the next 10 frame. He'll know that this is already 10, so if we add one more to 10, he just looks and sees that it's 11. And we continue with this lesson, and we'll just talk about it kind of informally, but just give him practice with seeing it on the 10 frames. Then after that, we'll go ahead and work on using the tiles with the bears. Now I like to model most of my mini lessons after the way the Abeka workbook presents them. So for example, when I showed you earlier how they presented the counting activities, there was one example where it gave them a number and they had to put out the number of, or circle the number of objects that match that number. So I normally don't start with that. I'll normally start with the other one, which is what you can see right here on the workbook, which is a bunch of objects they have to count and then we'll circle. So for example, I'll go ahead and I'll put down the number tiles to give him the choices of numbers that we're working with. And then I'll just put a bunch of bears out. And then he'll go ahead and count them and pick the correct number. So for this example, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. He'll go ahead and say, oh, there's 11 bears here. We'll take the bears away, take the tile away, and continue. And I'll do that probably 2 to 3 times, just practicing. He goes through it pretty quickly, so it doesn't take longer than 2 minutes. Then I'll go ahead and I'll change it up and go use a different method of teaching the counting, and I'll go ahead and say, here's the number 14, put out 14 bears, or make a group of 14. And it gives him the opposite of what I was doing earlier, just to give him more exposure to the different ways he's going to learn counting in the workbook, but then also in real life. So that's how I use the tiles along with the bears and the 10 frame for a typical lesson. Then we go ahead and we go into the workbook. And the nice thing about using a mini lesson like that, where it's hands-on and he gets a lot of practice on one-on-one with me, is he goes to the workbook and he already knows what to do. I go ahead and read the instructions, and then I start cleaning up our school day supplies while he works on this top section. I mean, he did this all by himself. When he gets to the tracing part, that is when I take a break from cleaning up, and I'll go ahead and we'll talk about the way to form the letter or the number, and maybe we have a poem to help with the formation of the number, and then he practices his tracing right down here. I forgot to do this with this one, but I'll normally pick his best one and put a sticker above it. He really likes knowing which one I felt was the best, and it's a little bit of motivation. He wouldn't mind getting stickers for all of them if he could. And then on the back of this page, as you can see, this lesson continued with just more practice with the counting, circling the correct number, and then more tracing practice. So that's how a typical lesson goes in our math. I will have a post coming up next week on Tuesday all about the curriculum as well and how I use it. And I plan on having a few free printables about the materials that you can use for teaching different topics. So be sure to check that post out on my website. I will be having a video coming up next week as well about a day or a school day in the life with my son. So you'll get to see him going through each of the lessons, the Good and the Beautiful curriculum, along with the Abeka and the Handwriting Without Tears curriculums, and just kind of see how he interacts with the manipulatives and interacts with the workbooks for a 5.5-year-old. Thank you so much for watching this walkthrough of a math lesson using the Abeka Number Skills K5 workbook. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any videos. Make sure to like the video if this was helpful for you, and please leave any questions you have about the curriculum or my methods in the comments section below. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.